Thanks for joining me for part 2 of this X-Men themed Blender tutorial. We're going to pick up where we left off last time and use geometry nodes to take our simple city scene and display it on the holographic map. Now that we've got our height map, let's go back into our hologram platform scene. Okay, so we're back in the hologram Blender scene. Now we want to apply that height map to our hologram platform to try and generate those buildings in 3 dimensions. So I'm just going to create a cube. Then in my Geometry Nodes tab, I'm just going to press New. I'm going to disconnect the link between the geometry group input and group output, and I'm going to create a grid node. And let's just connect up the geometry there and see what it looks like. So you can see it's just sitting there underneath the platform. Let's just raise it up so it's in contact with the platform. And I'm just going to go to the overhead view and I'm going to scale up the size. So let's try 4 meters. You want it to be large enough just so that it fully encompasses the size of the circular platform. So let's try 4.3, 4.4. That looks pretty good. And the number of vertices here is going to define the resolution of your 3D display. So the fewer vertices you have, the lower the resolution of the display. But obviously the more vertices you have, the greater the demand on the performance of your computer. So just for this experimental stage, I'm going to select 50 vertices in both directions. And that's looking pretty good. So now let's work on making the rest of the geometry nodes tree. So the first thing I want to do is work towards cutting off these edges so that the instance geometry fits just on this circular plane and not outside. So we basically want to delete the geometry if it's greater than a certain radius from the center of the plane. So I'm going to create a attribute vector math node and just connect it here. And I want to calculate the distance from the position of each point on this grid. And I want to change B from an attribute to a vector. And I want to calculate the distance from the origin of this plane, 0, 0, 0, and I'm going to output that value to a attribute called distance. So now if you go up here to your spreadsheet, you can see under the vertex section, I've got this new attribute called distance, and that calculates the distance from the center of the plane to each individual point on my grid here. So if I switch to wireframe, you can see it's calculating the distance from each of these points to the center. So now I want to create a attribute math node. Connect that in there. And I want to use a comparison tool, so greater than. So if distance is greater than, I want to change this to float because I want it to be a fixed radius. Let's say 4. Let's call the output delete geometry because I want it to be essentially a mask that says if it's 0, don't delete it, and if it's 1, I do want to delete it. So in this case, since the dimensions of our square are 4.4 by 4.4, I actually want to do about, let's try half of it. So let's pick a distance of 2. Now you can see if I scroll up through my spreadsheet here, I've got variation in the delete geometry attribute. So I've got 0s for don't delete and 1 for do delete. So let's add a delete geometry node after. So I want to delete the geometry based on the selection, and my selection is the delete geometry boolean here. And now you can see it's sort of cut it off there, and you can see it's quite jagged, and that's just due to the limited number of vertices that I've selected here. So I'll probably end up rendering it with something close to 200 or 300, but for now you can see it's sort of working. But I'm just going to drag up the radius now just so it fits within this outer region here on the platform, and we can make changes to that later. Okay, so let's just work on trying to get these buildings displayed on the 3D display now. So the way I'm going to do this is with an attribute sample texture node, and I'm going to place that just after here. So we're going to import the height map that we generated in the last step as the texture. So I'm going to create a new texture. Let's go over to our texture window here, We want it to be an image or movie. Let's just call it building. Let's go open. And I want to bring in my building.exr file here. And you can see it here being displayed in a preview. You can see it's the 1024 by 1024. And for the mapping, I want to select my UV map, which is just be the default UV map for my plane here. And I want to output that as height building. So now I want to instance a geometry which will represent the relative height of the buildings. So I'm just going to create a new cube, and let's just call it instance. So we can hide this. Now if I click back on the geometry nodes, I want to use a point instance node, and I'm just going to place it right there. And I want to instance my cube, which is instance. And you can see it looks absolutely crazy. So let's start by, let's add a point scale node just before the point instance. Let's change this to a float, and I'm going to add a value node just so I can control it here. And I'm just going to bring it down a little bit, holding shift to give me a bit more control. I'm just going to go to the overhead view. So I want the relative height of my squares or my cubes to be such that the cubes are perfectly tessellated. So let's try 0.03. Let's just get it approximately correct. There you can see I've got a whole lot of cubes there, and they've been cut off at a certain radius. Let's actually bring that radius down a little bit. Something like that. So now I want to control the relative scale or the height of these cubes using the texture coordinate, our height map. So the way you can do this is use a attribute combine x, y, z, and for now I'm just going to place that just before the delete geometry. So I don't want to affect the x or y scale, so I'm going to select values of 1 for x and y. And I want to change the Z to be an attribute because I want to use my height building attribute here to control the Z scale. So let's type in height building, and you can see nothing's happening now. And that's because I haven't selected an attribute to save this to. So for the moment, I'm just going to call this Z scale. Then I'm going to add a point scale node directly after and change this to attribute. So this is going to affect the scale of all my points. And I want the relative height to be defined by this factor, which will just be the attribute from the last step, which will just be Z scale. And you can see we're starting to get something there. You can see what look like the buildings here starting to appear. So to make the buildings look more like buildings, I'm going to use a attribute map range. And I'm going to place that directly after my attribute sample texture. So I want to resample my height building, and I want to save it back in height building. So let's attach a viewer node here, and let's have a look at what the output of the texture sample is. And I wanted to change evaluated to viewer node. So you can see we have a lot of 0 values here in the spreadsheet. But if you scroll down and look carefully, you can see we have small non-negative values here of 0.126, representing one of our building heights. There's another one of 0.871, and here's one closer to 1. So it looks like our values run from a minimum of 0 to a maximum of 1, but we want to increase the height. So I'm just going to drag this to max value up, and now you can see the buildings are starting to appear in sort of a voxelized way. So you can adjust this to whatever you like. That's looking pretty good. One problem you might notice is that the buildings are being scaled in the negative Z direction as well. And the reason for that is our origin point on our instance cube is in the center of the cube and not on the bottom. So let's fix that up. So let's click on the instance cube, make that visible again. You can see the little orange dot indicates the center of the cube at the origin point. So let's move that. So I'm just going to go into, let's go to layout again. I'm just going to click face select mode, select the bottom. I'm going to go mesh, snap, cursor to selected, exit edit mode, go object, set origin, origin to 3D cursor. Now I can hide that instance again. Now if you have a look underneath the 3D platform, you can see we haven't got any geometry coming through anymore. And we have our buildings there. But because I've changed the origin point, the scaling's not quite right again. So let's go back to geometry nodes. And I can probably half this down, this 2 max value down to about 25 now. And that's looking pretty good. You notice it's quite voxelized at the moment, but you can fix that just by increasing the number of vertices here, which we'll do closer to the end of the tutorial. So you could animate these parameters if you wanted to and make the buildings go from a flat surface to something like we had a moment ago at 25. What we're going to do is make our second animated texture to make the buildings appear and disappear and just give it a more interesting effect. So let's go back to our building texture blender scene that we worked on earlier. So in the movie as well, they had a sort of a wave pattern that blended the different parts of the scene together. So once they'd finished looking at the buildings, a wave would then essentially brush away all the buildings and then a new part of the scene would appear. So we're going to create a wave animated texture to simulate that effect. So I'm going to use the same setup as I did for the buildings, where we have an orthographic camera above a plane, but I'm going to apply a material directly to the plane this time. So I'm going to click on the plane, click new. Let's delete that and create an emission. Connect the emission up. Now let's create a wave texture. Let's add a color ramp. Let's change bands to rings and change X to Z. And I'm going to click on the last wave texture node and go Control T. And let's connect the object. And let's just drop the scale a little bit so we can see it. So let's just go back to the camera and just make sure our camera encompasses the wave pattern. Something like that. Now let's adjust these texture settings a little bit. So let's decrease the scale a little bit and let's just use the phase offset here. Now white is going to indicate a high region and black is going to indicate a low region. So I think I actually want to flip the color ramp here. So let's go flip color ramp. And let's adjust to B-spline because I want more of a gradual change between the two. And something like that. So if you do the phase offset then, we'll get this wave displacement. So something like that looks pretty cool. Let's just drop the distortion back, have it back at 0. Might just add a little bit, something like that. Now if I just set the phase offset back to 0, I'm just going to add a timeline here. And I reckon I roughly want this to go for probably about 3 seconds. So I'm going to do 25 frames a second, so I'm going to do a total of 75 frames. Okay, so that's looking pretty good now. So we want to start animating this wave texture so we get an interesting effect in our final 3D holographic scene. So we want to be able to animate this multiplication factor here just so we can make the wave appear and then disappear. We also want to adjust the phase offset so the wave travels outwards from the center. So let's go back to frame 1. Let's start with the phase offset at 0 and keyframe it with the eye. Now let's go up to frame 75 and let's just drag the phase offset. We'll have to make it negative in this case. So we want to go from this position here, and I reckon probably just have I reckon that's probably enough. One of these rings has gone from the center out to the edge, so let's keyframe it there. See what that looks like. Actually looks like we'll need linear interpolation, so let's just bring up a graph editor here. And here's the parameter here. So if we just click here and select all, click channel, extrapolation mode, do linear extrapolation. Now if we just change this back to a timeline and drag down, let's restart the animation. You can see it's linear on both ends, so it doesn't slow down and speed up at the ends. Let's just play that, make sure that looks reasonable. That's looking pretty good. Let's try that. So let's go back here. Let's adjust our render properties. So we want frame 1 start, frame 75 end. So for this, I don't need quite so much height resolution. So I'm just going to render it out as a PNG file. So I'm just going to use 16-bit color depth just to give me a little bit more height resolution. Still, I'm going to keep the resolution at 1024 by 1024, but again, increase that if you want more precision in your 3D holographic resolution. We can use the Eevee render engine here, that's fine. And everything else is the same. So just save it and go render animation. Okay, so that's finished rendering now. And you can see I have all my wave texture images here. So let's close this Blender scene now and go back to our holographic display scene. So at this point here, we want to create a second attribute sample texture node. So let's just drag all these to the left. And I'm going to place the second attribute sample texture node directly after the first. And I'm going to create a new one. And this time I'm going to call it wave. Again, I want to use the UV mapping. And I'm going to call this wave height. And for this, you're going to have to create a duplicate attribute map range. You can either put it before or after the first, but this time you want to change height building to wave height, or height to wave, depending on how you did it. And you want to save that out as wave height as well. And we're going to have to adjust these properties again. So let's just have a look. Let's add another viewer node, and let's connect it from the attribute sample texture node for the wave height. And let's have a look at what the wave height values look like. And of course we're not going to see anything because I haven't brought in the texture yet. So if we go over to the texture page here on the right hand side, again we want an image or movie. Let's go open. So I've got my wave texture folder here that I just exported all the images to, and I want to shift select all the images, the wave images, go open image. And you can see it's brought it in as an image sequence. But I need to change the number of frames to 75. I want it to be cyclic and auto refresh turned on. Now you can see we're getting some values here. So again, we're getting values of, let's have a look. We're going from about 0, I can see values of about 0.5 here, 0.56, 0.57. So I think for the moment, having a attribute map range input from minimum to maximum of 0 to 1 will work okay for this one as well. Let's have a look what that wave texture looks like. So in the attribute combine node here, we can change the height building. Let's just change that to wave height. And then you can see we've got something that looks like our wave texture here. If I just bring up a timeline here, and let's start the animation. Let's go to frame 75 and press play. And you can see the wave texture there. It's a little bit too high, so I'm going to drop the maximum here down to something like that. Just going to bring this down to about a value of 10 for now, and let's have a look what that animation looks like. Man, that's looking pretty cool. Now we want some way to be able to control which of these two textures gets displayed, the buildings or the wave, so that the waves sort of wash away the buildings. So for that we're going to need an attribute mix node. Let's connect it here. So we want one of our attributes to be the wave height. We want the other one to be the height building. And let's just call the output for this height to represent the current height, depending on the factor we've got here, to either give us the wave or the building or some combination of the two. And then we want to change the attribute combine XYZ, and we want to change that to height. And now you can see the effect that it's had. It's combined bits of the building with the wave texture. So now if I drag this factor all the way to 0, we've got the wave. And if we go all the way to the right, we've got just the buildings. So we can use this to animate between the two and give somewhat of an effect of the wave removing the buildings from the scene, something similar to what happens in the movie. So let's increase this to 250 frames for the whole animation. And because we've got cyclic turned on, it will just keep endlessly looping. You might want to restructure this animation so that it gives a seamless loop, but I'll leave that up to you, and you can make this holographic display whatever you want it to. So I want it to start with the buildings, and we're going to let it display for a while, and then we're going to transition to the waves, just so it looks like it's washing away the buildings. Let's say give it about 4 seconds with the buildings at 25 frames a second. So at frame 0, I'm going to keyframe factor equal to 1. At frame 100, I am going to also keyframe a value of 1 for the factor. And then we want it to slowly reduce to 0 over, let's say, 2 seconds. So let's go to frame 150 and let's drop that to 0. And let's see what that looks like. So to make this animation a little bit more seamless, I'm actually going to re-export my wave animation with something closer to maybe 200 frames, and then we'll come back. Okay, so I've just baked out 250 frames for my wave texture. I'm just going to bring the new images in. So I'm just going to shift select all 250 of my new frames. And I want to say I've got 250 frames here. If you're not sure how to do this, just go back to the step where I baked out the wave texture and change your final animation frame to 250. And because we chose linear extrapolation for our keyframes, you won't have to adjust any of the keyframes. So let's have a look what this animation looks like now. Okay, so that's looking pretty good now. And just as a final bit of the animation, I think I want the height of the waves to dissipate towards frame 250. So I reckon at about, let's try at about frame 190, I am going to keyframe the maximum height in the attribute map range node for the height of the waves. I'm going to keyframe that at 10. Let's say at frame 220, I want to keyframe toMax to be 0, so the waves have disappeared. I'm just going to select the playback here and go frame dropping, just so we play the animation in real time. And let's test it now. So I reckon maybe the waves are dissipating just a little bit too quickly. So I'm just going to drag this keyframe back maybe about there. Let's play that. That's looking a bit better. Okay, so I'm just going to increase the height of my buildings just a little bit. Just so when I view it through the camera, the height of the building's a little bit more reasonable. And I'm going to increase the number of vertices now. Let's increase it to 150. And you can see that's increased the resolution of the animation, but we also need to adjust this scale value now. If we view it from the top viewport, just want to bring that scale down. So I multiply it by 3, so I need to divide this by 3. And I might also need to adjust the map range values again. You can see adding that little bit more resolution now, you can see a bit more definition in the height of the building here, and this one here as well. So I'm going to increase that to 100. It's maybe a little bit too high for the camera. Let's drop it to 90. So we'll probably have to adjust the wave height as well. But because we've keyframed it, let's just go down here. So we still want it to go to 0 at this last keyframe here, but I just want to increase the max at this point here just to add a bit more wave. Maybe something like that. So I've just increased it to 23 and I want to reapply the keyframe there. Let's just go back to layout mode and let's look at the final animation now. So we've got our buildings there. And then the waves come in. So keeping in line with the movie, the material of the buildings and the waves was actually the same as the inner part of the holographic display here. So we want to apply that same material to the buildings. But because these buildings are made of instances of our instance cube, we need to apply the material to this object here. So if you select your instance and select inner material for that, let's go to viewport display. And you can see we've got a consistent material now. So let's add a HDRI to the scene. So I'm just going to go to my world settings. I'm going to select environment texture. I'm just going to pull in this HDRI that I got from Polyhaven. Let's go rendered view. I've selected a slightly overcast HDRI. And I might actually decrease the strength of the HDRI to, let's try 0.60. And for this I might actually try rendering it in the Cycles render engine. That's looking okay. So I just want to smooth out the edges of my instance cubes here. So I'm just going to unhide my cube. I'm just going to go into edit mode and I'm going to select these 4 edges and Control B. Just to add a slight bevel there. Then I'm going to right click, go shade smooth, go down here with my cube selected, go to the object data properties and go auto smooth. And that just smooths out the edges a little bit on my instance cubes. So we can hide that again. And I might actually close the gap between these cubes just so they're in complete contact with each other. So let's go to the geometry nodes. Let's select our holographic display again. And I just want to increase the value of this scale just a little bit. You can see there's a bit of a gap between this, so let's just increase this to let's just increase this to 0.015, 0.0145, 0.0146, a little bit more, 0.0147, and that's probably close enough now. And it looks like I might just pan the camera up just a little bit, just so we get all the building in there. So I want to render an animation of about 200 frames long, so I'm just going to put my end frame to 200. I'm going to render this out as an MPEG-4 with MPEG-4 container. Let's go perceptual lossless. I'm just going to save it out to my desktop. Save it out as full HD. Let's turn render denoising on. I'm going to use the open image denoiser. I'm going to increase the number of tiles. Let's go 256 by 256 because I'm using a GPU to render this out. And let's go render and see what that looks like. So I'm actually going to reduce the number of samples down to, let's try 32, see what that looks like. So with the denoiser, I think that'll actually be okay, but feel free to use more samples. So after that, I just did some final tweaks to the Blender scene to get the effect I wanted, but feel free to customize it in any way that you like. I ended up rendering in the Eevee render engine. I deleted the HDRI and I replaced it with some area lights and spotlights. I also constrained the camera to be on a circle curve and animated the camera orbiting around the 3D platform. I also changed the material properties of the central platform, and finally I increased the number of vertices on the geometry nodes grid to 512 by 512 vertices, and reducing the point scale value accordingly. And finally I rendered out the animation. Thank you very much for watching this tutorial. I would love to see your own creations inspired by this video, so please feel free to share them with me on Twitter. My Twitter link is in the About section of my YouTube channel. If you did enjoy this video or any of my other tutorials, please don't forget to like it and subscribe to my channel to be notified of future Blender tutorials. Thanks again, and I hope to see you soon for another Blender tutorial. Take care.